Joining us now, the Chief of Staff of Governor Ralph Northam, Clark Mercer. Clark, great to have you.
Hey, thanks for having me on, John.
All right, so the governor yesterday issuing a stay-at-home order, changing it from a suggestion to an executive order, extending it to June 10th. So let's break this down. A lot of us shocked that he extended it 10 weeks out because a lot of small businesses called me today and last night that I know, and they're like, I just can't survive till June 10th. I'm just going to shut my business down now. Can you clarify why the decision on June 10th was made?
Sure. June 10th is the original date for the emergency order that the governor initially made a couple weeks ago, and so we mirrored it up with that. We will obviously evaluate this, and if we can lift it earlier, we certainly will do so. But rather than issuing one every week or every 2 weeks, we lined it up with the original emergency order that the governor made. And like I said, we would very much like to be able to revisit this and lift it early if we can.
What would the metrics be that would lead the governor to take the executive order shutdown off earlier?
Looking at the number of cases, but not only cases, ICU admissions that we have in our hospitals is the main metric that he has been using. ICU admissions is a more accurate reflection of the severity of the coronavirus in our hospitals as opposed to just cases. So, and that's something that I think from his time in the Army when he was in Germany, and that was the site where folks were first airlifted out of the Gulf to be treated. So he's kind of used to working in that environment, and it's really the ICU beds and ICU admissions.
Clark, that makes sense to me. Why isn't that number out there? Like we get every day the number of cases, the number of who's died. We get the number of people hospitalized, but we don't get ICU admissions. How can you make that number available? Because that makes sense to people, I think.
Yeah, we can certainly work to make it available. And we've been, working with our hospitals to get a better real-time count from all of them. Not a cumulative count, so how many folks have been in ICU since the start, but how many folks at one moment in time are in the ICU. And so we can certainly work to make that available to the public.
Because the concern about ICU is, I think everybody is now grasping this, is not to have sicknesses from the virus that overrun our hospital beds, ventilators, people that need the care to stay alive, and you don't want to get those overrun, so we want to spread that out over time. So I think everybody understands that. The frustration is those numbers are not made publicly available or they're not out there. Maybe the governor should encourage those who are publishing the numbers to get those out on a daily basis.
Gotcha. Well, we can do a better job of getting those numbers out.
Especially as it relates to the beds, like in Virginia, we have so many ICU beds available. So if you're at, 10% capacity, that's one thing. If you're at 90%, now you're in the danger zone, or 80%, because if you get the spike, then people can't get the proper care that they need, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. A lot of people have said, okay, June 10th, that it's one day after the June 9th primary. Is there election considerations that came into play? Are you able to comment on that?
Sure. In the order, it kind of lists a series of reasons why you would venture out, and one of those is for government operations, and we would certainly consider the primary a government operation. So, as we approach the first decision point we have is how we handle the localities elections in May, which will be, we're meeting with our elections folks today and have been for the last week or so, and so we'll have some direction on the May elections first, but I don't think folks should read into the June 10th date as something that indicates one way or the other how we'd handle the June 9th primaries.
Okay, so that's open. Right now, it seems like you're focused on what you're going to do with the municipal elections in May. And so the governor can forestall them for 2 weeks, as I understand it. The Supreme Court of Virginia, 30 days, but that's it. So are you going to be discussing, could it be a mail-in ballot, or everybody gets an absentee? Because the concern that we've heard from people, it's like not the people voting, it's the poll workers normally are senior citizens. And so that's right, where the risk is, right?
Yep, and you just listed kind of all the options that we're looking at. Obviously, the General Assembly and how they treat their special session and what they might be able to do legislatively with that date would be another option. But we're working with the Attorney General's office and elections and have asked them to provide us all of the options. So mail-in ballots, absentee ballots, all of the things you just mentioned are on the table. And I think the governor yesterday at his press conference said that in the next few days you would have an update and a bit of clarity on how we'll handle the May elections.
So from what the governor did yesterday, the executive order that made national news, what is different from the suggestion he had on Friday? Like, what's different? If I'm abiding by the suggestions, how does it differently affect my life?
Sure. It's a good question. Well, one of the things we've been working with is with our counterparts in North Carolina, D.C., and Maryland, and trying to be, to the extent we can, consistent so that there's a consistent message, especially up in the District, Maryland, and Virginia region where folks go back and forth all the time, with our truckers who go back and forth to the Mid-Atlantic, especially South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. The governor, obviously, these press conferences, John, is they're a messaging opportunity for Virginians to listen to them, and so we try to use those to heighten the message from one conference to the next. A couple of the main differences: one, obviously, beaches were added to the executive order yesterday. We've had some issues in Hampton Roads, as you can imagine, and some little bit of a hodgepodge of enforcement of how the localities have handled their beaches. Richmond, the James River. We've got Texas Beach, which I know has been an issue for the mayor, and he took some action yesterday. So limiting beaches to exercising or fishing was in the executive order, and that's enforceable. We don't want to see the crowds like we've seen in other states, and we had some concerns, especially in Virginia Beach and Norfolk, that was an issue. Overnight campgrounds on private campgrounds. We had some rural delegates from the Republican side of the aisle reach out and express some real concern that with the state parks closed down to overnight visitors, that our private campgrounds were going to be overrun with folks moving there with their reservations canceled, and also folks from out of state, from up in the, especially up in the north, coming down and trying to hunker down and see this thing through. So the order, we have a lot of folks, John, as you know, that live in campgrounds permanently or 6 months or a year. So this is for temporary stays, 14 days or less. Mm-hmm. And then the order up front just explicitly lists the reasons, and it's consistent with most other states that have done this, about why you would leave your home. And it's, common sense stuff. It's to get food for your family. It's to go to the pharmacy. It's to go to work. It does not expand the businesses that are closed. We feel like the businesses that remain open have been very responsible with the social distancing, are taking this seriously. The crowd sizes, the beaches, the campgrounds, the schools, those are enforceable by code. We're a bit wary of using the criminal code to stop people on the street and ask them to produce a document about where they're going. That's something other states say they will be aggressive with.
Clark, how is that different from Maryland? And by the way, we're with Clark Mercer. Clark is the chief of staff of the governor of Virginia, Governor Ralph Northam. I've had a lot of debate on this, various people calling in today that live in Maryland or texted me earlier. What is different between the way it'll be looked at in Virginia? Ralph Northam said there'll be a warning, and the way it's being dealt with by the police in Maryland. What's the difference? Well,
one, right now it's a messaging routine with the states. We'll see how Maryland enforces it. A Class 1, misdemeanor in Virginia is a $2,500 fine and punishable by a year in jail. And that would be the tool available to the governor. There's not a civil fine available. And to go to a Class 1 misdemeanor for leaving your home, if you don't have the proper paperwork on your person or can't properly articulate to the police where you're going, is just a step right now that we're not going to take. And we will obviously continue to evaluate this, but we certainly trust and believe in Virginians to do the right thing, large and whole they are. The couple problem spots that we've identified, particularly the large gatherings, we do have the ability, and we have had the ability for several weeks, to use the criminal code to enforce that. We will continue let the localities avail themselves of that tool. But this is a situation where I think there can obviously be, John, some unintended consequences and perhaps intended consequences of taking actions. And a year in jail for someone for leaving their home without a well-articulated reason is not necessarily a step that we're going to be taking. So,
well, I would hope not to
right.
spend a year in jail because you took a wrong turn in your Chevy and can't produce a grocery list. Seems a little extreme. I think you would agree
Right.
with that. But
that's our thinking as well. So.
All right. Well, that's what's got people worried. A couple other questions here. John from Virginia Beach says, hey, can you ask Clark? He says, I can go to the beach to exercise. Can I swim or do I just have to walk?
That's a good question.
Isn't it?
That's a great question. And that came up. I would consider swimming to be exercise. What we're trying, look, it's funny John would ask that because we had a spirited and robust conversation about that very topic. And look, it goes against, right? Everyone wants to go to the beach and swim and sunbathe, right? What we don't want folks to do is pull up a cooler with their family
right.
and 1,000 other families and sit there for the day and sunbathe and swim. But certainly jumping in the ocean and swimming, for 15, 20 minutes and getting out is certainly exercise. It's a lot of states, and Maryland's one of them, that has just shut down the beaches entirely. Nobody can go out on the beaches, period. We do think it's important to be able to go out, take a walk, get some fresh air, get a swim, have some folks surf fishing, obviously keeping their distance from folks, applying common sense. But that's a good question, and we would consider, swimming for the purpose of exercise to be just that. So.
I got a question from Holly in Richmond who says, can you ask Clark about any plans for a special session? Rumor is the Richmond Convention Center is being proposed so social distance between members can be observed. Is there any way to do it by video?
Yeah, that's a rumor that we've heard as well, and it's not one that has been shared with me by the legislature. I know they're brainstorming. I think it's a decent rumor, in terms of some of them I've heard have not been great rumors. But, the legislature is confined by, obviously, the Constitution and their own rules. And I know the clerks and leadership are exploring what they can and can't do and what they could do remotely. And, we're in touch with them, but that's something that we need to make sure we're working with the legislative branch on. But we're very mindful of not wanting to pack, 140 members together with their aides, with staff. That being said, we've got to follow the Constitution, and we're still constitutionally required to crank through all the bills that we're cranking through and take action on the budget and do those things. So we're trying to do that in the most responsible fashion.
Follow up from Holly. She says, also any word on a special session in August, possibly to see how the economic forecast is and what other changes in law need to be made to modify federal actions?
Gotcha. That's another great question. I think by next month, if anyone told you, John, that they could tell you exactly what the revenue forecasts and the economy and budget would be, they're just not being honest with you. So I think we've got to get through next month in the budget, but we need to do so in a way that's responsible and is cautious and gives us the room to come back when things have settled down a bit and forecast in a way that we have some confidence with what that forecast is. So Holly is thinking very much along the lines of how we're thinking. I don't know if that means a special session or not, but it certainly means addressing the budget in a way next month that gives us a responsible path forward to come back and revisit it later in the year. So,
Tom in Jacksonville texted in. He says, I applaud Governor Northam for understanding how important fishing is. Hell yes, fishing. So you're good there. Got a couple others here. Christine in Washington, D.C. says, I go to a shooting range in Northern Virginia. When can I go back to my shooting ranges for my protection?
That's a good question. And I'll be back on your show. I'll check exactly how shooting ranges are being handled. Those are certainly businesses that I think by definition of a shooting range, and I've been to plenty of shooting ranges myself, practice social distancing. And so, I hear it's not only for protection, but it's for recreation, and it's a good way to blow off steam. So it's one of those things that we're going to have to think about. And, if she's in D.C., I would imagine she's coming to shooting ranges in Virginia.
Yes.
And right, and so we'll certainly, address that. And I don't have a crystal clear answer for it right now. So
why do you sound so reasonable?
John, it's what you do to me.
I mean, you sound like.
Oh, look!
We're just having a reasonable conversation. I mean,
I said this last week when I was on, but we've got to be able to put aside, the policy fights that we'll have in the future and disagreements, and that's fine. And but we've got to get through this together. And the governor was on with President Trump and Vice President Pence just a couple days ago, and they do a roll call of every governor that was on, and it was for the most part, it was a very collegial conversation. There's a few governors I think that look to get a soundbite out of these meetings and opportunities. I think Governor Northam, he said two things to the president. One, he said that we're pulling for you, we're rooting for you, we want to work with you. You're going to come down, and thank you for seeing off our sailors in Hampton Roads, and we're proud to be able to contribute. It's a sacrifice, and Hampton Roads is called the answer to duty. So thank you for that, and that if you're successful at the national level, we're successful. So we're all pulling for you. And then he asked, a specific question about kind of best and worst case timelines for this coronavirus. But he's not looking to make sound bites. You don't see him on. You would not. He has not been on one of the cable TV networks. Folks have said, why don't you go on more cable TV and get the doctor out there? And I think he might do that, but he has been very cautious and concentrating on Virginia and our response here. So,
all right, final question here from Amy in Fairfax, Northern Virginia. Amy says, "Tell Clark I bring." See, people are like calling you dude by your first name. Tell Clark I bring absentee ballots to nursing homes and collect them after they are notarized. Will voting only be by mail on June 9th? I'm a senior citizen myself and not sure if delivering ballots are a crucial activity. Amy in Fairfax.
Well, first of all, thank Amy for doing that. That's an important piece of keeping our elections running. We're looking at that. We're looking at folks that work in nursing homes and might work in more than one nursing home, and trying to address making sure that we don't have folks traveling between multiple nursing homes. And if you drop off or pick up absentee ballots at nursing homes, I would imagine you do multiple nursing homes. And I think that would be an issue for us that we'd want to really think through, because we are, our most vulnerable folks are in nursing homes. And so we're doing our best to lock those down and really prevent visitors from coming in. We don't want this thing spread throughout our nursing homes. So that's one of the issues that we're looking at, John.
All right, Ivan in Woodbridge, final question says, ask Clark, how does the governor have the authority to do this? Is it not unconstitutional?
Yeah, well, obviously, John, we wouldn't take this action if it was unconstitutional. And look, this, and I don't know what John's, political worldview is, but this is a very difficult situation, John. You talk about it a lot on your show, not only for, Democrats and Republicans, but libertarians, folks that, just don't like. Look, nobody likes the government's entry into private life and into commerce. And you look across the country, and that's happening. And it's a very, very difficult balance to strike. But we don't take any of these actions without first, obviously, going through our own counsel, going through the Attorney General's office, and making sure we've checked all those boxes. But I appreciate the question. I understand why he would ask it, but we're not taking these actions unilaterally.
It sounds like, Clark, from the 25 minutes you've been with us, that you're talking to the president, you're trying to get a reasonable approach. June 10th seems to be your last resort as the outside. The metric, I think the biggest thing out of this conversation is your reasonable approach. I think that's going to be taken as comfort to people that you guys are trying to do the right thing and it's not just a government overreach. But I think one of the most critical things that you said is that the metric on reopening business in Virginia and lifting the executive order is going to be based on the number of ICU admissions and how that correlates to total number of ICU beds that we have. I would again encourage the Northam administration to put that out on a daily basis. Number of ICU beds we have, number of people admitted, because the reasonable people, Clark, they can understand that. The frustration that so many of us have is, and I've asked every politician this, I've asked leaders this, like Steve Bannon, give me the metric. When do we reopen? What does shatter the curve mean? Well, what does Bennett? I think you're the first one that actually gave me an answer, and I appreciate that. I think if you put that out, Virginians will understand what we're up against. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, John. Thanks for having me on.
No, thank you. Really, I really appreciate the time. I know it's easy to, just sit back and do a soundbite, but thank you for that. Very reasonable dialogue. Clark Mercer, the Chief of Staff of the Governor of Virginia, Governor Ralph Northam.